Well everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 4 and see how this particular iPhone holds up in 2024. Now it's been about 14 years since this particular iPhone came out. How crazy is that? This iPhone came out so long ago, I can't even believe it's already been this long if I'm being completely honest. But I probably would tell you, and this is probably not a shocker to anybody, this iPhone is probably not worth buying for the average person out there. You are much better off purchasing an iPhone that is still somewhat supported with software, and this one doesn't really make any sense to go ahead and buy, probably for the average person. So just kind of keep that in mind. There are definitely some iPhones I would recommend buying. Those will be linked down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 4, on the front of this particular phone, again, keep in mind, this thing came out in 2010. So that was so many years ago, okay? That wasn't just today or yesterday. This thing on the front had a 3.5-inch IPS LCD panel on the front. How crazy is that? That's such a small panel to have, and when you compare it to now, I mean, the 5.7-inch display on the 13 mini was small. That was a mini iPhone. This thing was the standard iPhone at that time. And this was also a time where a lot of people would kind of make fun of iPhones because they were so small, and Androids like the Galaxy Note 2 and those phones were much bigger. This one is very interesting from that perspective because it is kind of an outdated phone, but it still looks very, very good for the most part. Like, of course, the panel is small, but the rest of the body still looks pretty good. You know, there's massive, bezels on the front. Pretty much the bezels on the front of this phone look as big, like combined as the display. So it's kind of funny how that ended up happening and how phones have emerged and changed since then. But I definitely would tell you a device like the iPhone 4 still looks very good for the most part. And I definitely do think that's a pretty big advantage for this type of device. And this was the first Retina display going on for this phone too. And coming from the iPhone 3GS, the 3GS to the iPhone 4 was probably one of the biggest changes from one generation to the other, probably from a majority of iPhones in my opinion. So from the front, that's just on the front. On the bottom, you were getting, still that old 30-pin connector on this iPhone, which still is like fine for a lot of people. You're getting a headphone jack on this phone as well. But the biggest thing, and I would say the biggest overlap between this phone and some of the newest phones, is actually the flat sides. It is insane to me how the flat sides on this phone still hold up from that perspective. Like, it's crazy. This makes this phone feel so much more modern than a lot of other devices in this particular, standpoint. When you look at an iPhone 3GS, that phone looks so outdated, it's like not even funny. When you look at the iPhone 4, yeah, it looks outdated, but it doesn't look as outdated as even an iPhone 6 kind of looks more outdated than this thing in some ways, to be honest. So I definitely do think the iPhone 4 with its flat sides give it a much more modern feeling way than some of the older iPhones, before this, and some of the iPhones after this as well. On the backside, full-on glass back. That is crazy. Having a full-on glass back on this type of iPhone is another really cool advantage. And that in and of itself is something that I look very much forward to with having on some of the, modern phones as well. It's crazy having that type of capability on this device and having flat sides and glass back. Like, it really is a super cool thing going on for this phone too, which is so amazing. So definitely gets a thumbs up for me as well. Overall, on the outside, it's a very, very good feeling iPhone. It still looks great. It still feels great. And there's still a lot of things to love about it. The things that are missing on this phone that we have nowadays though, it's a fairly lower resolution panel, no AMOLED or OLED display, very big bezels on it, no fingerprint sensor or anything like that, no IP certification, no wireless charging. Definitely some areas of this phone which don't look that great, but regardless, I think it's still like a pretty good looking phone nonetheless, and it still is a phone that I love looking at for sure. Now on top of that, from a camera standpoint, this was kind of another big asset going on for this phone too. So on the backside, you were getting a 5 megapixel 720p camera. And on the front, you were getting a VGA camera, whatever that means. Now with this type of device, again, it's a pretty outdated camera when it comes down to it. I think everyone will kind of know that. When you are getting a device like the iPhone 4, it's going to be outdated in so many different ways, it's not even funny. But this device from a camera standpoint, this is definitely one of the bigger areas going on where I would be like, okay, like this is probably why you don't want to buy this phone. Just from a camera standpoint, it's already outdated. Think about it in all the other ways as well. Like this camera, no 4K, no anything like that. I don't want to harp on it too much, but back in 2010, this was a very good camera. So it's funny and crazy to think back, back in those days and how good cameras have gotten since then. And that's something that's actually very cool. And I give Apple a lot of credit for giving us really good cameras now. But back then, and looking at cameras now, there's definitely been massive improvements since then. So kind of keep that in mind, but not the biggest deal in the world, but just something to kind of keep in mind there. Now, in terms of software longevity, this is so insane. The thing you have to keep in mind is that with the iPhone 4, this phone got outdated with software on what version? Like iOS 7? That is probably not the best version of software for this thing to end off on. It was a very big iOS version to kind of end off at. And that's kind of a small problem going on for this type of device because it ended off at a very, very monumental iOS change, but it also brought a lot of things to the table. It changed a lot, and it wasn't the most stable version of iOS. iOS 7 was so long ago, it was like 10 iOS versions ago. I don't think anybody's thinking about iOS 7 anymore in terms of like using it. But I think the biggest thing here is that even if you want to be like, oh, iOS 7 is perfectly fine for me, there's like no apps you can download or update to on iOS 7. iOS 7 was severely outdated already, and the problem with iOS 7 is that you can't install any application you want to. You have to download like 2012 versions of iOS updates. So that is the biggest problem going on, I would say, for iOS 7, is that you're having to basically use apps that are so outdated. That is a problem, and I don't really think anybody wants to go ahead and use those types of devices anymore either. So keep that in mind. Not like the biggest deal it is probably the biggest deal in the world, and that is probably the biggest disadvantage of buying a device like this. So keep that in mind. That's kind of how this device holds up from a software standpoint. From a performance standpoint, this is another pretty big thing going on here too. What else is there to say? This device is outdated from it has the Apple A4 chip inside. You're getting like 512 megabytes of RAM. That is pretty much a telltale sign of not using this device anymore either. This device, like I said, came out so long ago. And because of that, this chipset isn't really as great as you could probably get from like a device that's like 2 or 3 years newer than this thing. So once again, that's kind of the problem. I would hate for you to go ahead and buy a device like this if it's already outdated. And that is a very big problem going on for this particular device. So personally for me, I look at a phone like the iPhone 4, and I don't really think anybody's planning on using this thing from actual performance standpoint, but that is kind of the problem that's going on when you're getting this device. I want to also say the majority of people are not actually probably looking at this video to use this device anymore, and I do understand that, but it's still actually very interesting how decent of a decent performance iOS 7 was giving us. Clearly, iOS 7 was not that great of a performing, software, but it's still actually insane to me how good of a job this thing did from a performance standpoint, even at that time. Like, apps and stuff still close and, perform fairly well. But to sum this video up and not beat around the bush anymore, I will definitely tell you, the iPhone 4 is not really worth buying in this day and age. I don't really think anybody should be purchasing this device anymore, and I think you are much better off purchasing a phone that is still supported with software. So basically, phones that are still supported with software are iPhones like, the iPhone 10R, 10S, 10S Max, and above. If you're buying an iPhone that's older than that, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense of purchasing those particular devices. You are much better off purchasing a device that is still supported with software rather than going through and try to use an iPhone like this. Even using an iPhone like an iPhone 5 or something, that is basically like, it's just not worth it in my opinion at all. However, there can be some reasons why you may want to buy a device that might still be decent, like an iPhone, like SE1 or like iPhone 10 if you want to use it. But going back to this generation just makes no sense. I honestly don't even think you can actually go through and use this phone for a lot of people out there. Like, I don't think SIM service even works on this thing. So take it as you will, but that's just like one big thing to kind of keep in mind. Otherwise though, I'd look at an iPhone, 10S, 10R, 10S Max. I'd recommend purchasing those iPhones. If you want to buy this as a collector's item, then go for it. But in every other way, I would not recommend buying this thing at all. So that pretty much covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.